O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Yesterday, we celebrated the 244th anniversary of the birth of the nation. The anniversary of its independence from England, the world's greatest colonial power at the time. It was something that no one thought could have been achieved because England was really the superpower of its day. This year, the events marking the 4th of July were not as numerous nor as public as previous years because of what we are going through. A number of things, if they did occur, were virtual. There were some things that did not fit into that pattern. Now, so there was one difference between this year and several other years. But there's also another significant difference, is that these celebrations this year occur at a time when our nation is confronting its past, some of which is ugly, especially with respect to the way it has treated African Americans. And let us not forget Native Americans. Over recent weeks, there have been debates about some of our statues and monuments erected to honor persons and events that are connected to very disturbing periods and activities in our past. Some have argued that these statues or monuments should be removed, while others say they are part of history, no matter how ugly that part of history may be, and they should remain in place. And some have arguments in between. The debate and the controversy over events and personalities of our past is not new. African Americans have always questioned them. However, the questioning has often been ignored. People who have questioned them have sometimes been labeled as troublemakers. But these questions have come to light because of the recent events going back to May with the death of George Floyd. Now, the 4th of July celebration is one that has always been questioned because African Americans have thought that they would like this country to be sincere in its motivations and just in its actions, even as it celebrates its independence from Great Britain. Slate magazine recently published an article entitled "The Best 4th of July Speech in American History." This speech was not delivered by a politician. It was not delivered by a president, a vice president, a senator, a member of the House of Representatives, but it was delivered by Frederick Douglass, the African-American abolitionist who was born in slavery. This speech was actually delivered on July 5th, 1852, 76 years after the Declaration of Independence. It was delivered to the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester. In that year, the 4th of July was commemorated fell on a Sunday rather. So the celebrations were held the following Monday. And as Frederick Douglass came to the podium, he came with a speech that he had spent days writing because he was troubled by what he saw as a hypocrisy between the words in the Declaration of Independence and the realities of slavery that Blacks were experiencing. Remember, this was 1852. Douglass who was born in slavery of a black mother and a white father, was by now free and had devoted himself to the abolishing of slavery. So some of the words of the Declaration of Independence were at the back of his mind as he prepared the speech and as he delivered it. And these words are, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Frederick Douglass and many abolitionists questioned how a nation that was born on the principle of liberty could still enslave its citizens. And Mr. Douglass entitled his speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" In it, he asked the following questions. Would you have me to argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is a rightful owner of his own body? And he goes on, "There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him." After some observations, he goes on, "What to the American slave is the 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he's a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling of vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parades and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deceptions, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty, of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour." I am sure that the ladies probably started to wonder if they had made the right choice in asking Frederick Douglass to be their keynote speaker on that year. Now, the relationship between then and now is clear. Even as Frederick Douglass questioned how a nation at that time could still have slaves, we question how a nation built on justice could still have so much injustice. So a story that comes to me is a story that was written by a Caucasian reporter for ProPublica. Something that he saw in Brooklyn some weeks ago, where some young kids were hit. One of them was actually brushed by a patrol car. They were in a group. And these kids were pulled in to the station house because there was a report that somebody had stolen something. And so these cops were patrolling the neighborhood and saw these young kids, 11, 12, 14, and pull them in. And when they would not even allow these kids to call their parents. And after they had questioned them and realized that nothing was wrong, they let the kids go. They didn't call the parents, they didn't give an explanation. And so this reporter, who along with his wife had witnessed all of what had gone on, went to the station house as an investigative reporter to find out what had happened. And all it was that the story, everything was pushed aside. These kids were traumatized. Can you believe it? 10, 12, 14. Traumatized by people who are supposed to uphold justice, adults, just because of their color and just because they did not think that they had power. And so you can understand some of the questioning in this day, and we could go on, and I could spend the whole day here talking about some of the injustices that we see. The injustices that we see every day and we hear about. And which some people are now just feel confident enough to share. Some people, especially people who don't go to church, have gone further to ask, where is the God of justice in all of this? Some have constantly asked, if God is listening to our cries and laments and prayers, where is God? We're told to pray and we're told to reach out to God, and we are told that God, who knows how to give good things to God's children, will answer. So where is God? Is God listening? This morning, I would like us to think about some lessons from the story read to us from Exodus chapter 3. The story of Moses and the burning bush. And so, even as I think about the story of Moses and the burning bush, I think about a story that took place some years ago when my wife was teaching Sunday school in one of the churches. And so, for Sunday school that morning, they had studied the story of Moses and the burning bush. And at the end of the class, she asked the kids, and they were probably about 5, 6 or so, and she said to them, so what did you all learn this morning? And one little girl, she was very quick to put up her hands. She held her hands up and she said, me. And so my wife said, what did you learn? She said, I learned that don't touch fire because fire will burn you. Now this morning, we know that fire will burn us, but I want us to go a little beyond that and talk about what we can learn and pull from the story of Moses and the burning bush. Now you all know the background. Moses has run away from Egypt. He has killed somebody and didn't know that he was seen. And when it came to him that it was known, he runs away into the land of Midian. And he's here with taking care of Jethro's sheep. And so he has gone from being in the palace to be a protector of sheep. And so here he is, and God appears to him. But there are some things about this that I want to remind you about as we think about this story. I want to remind us, first of all, about God's attention. God's attention. So, firstly, God is ready to act and searches out Moses to be the agent of change. God has heard the cry of the people. And so God says to Moses, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. The children of Israel are in Egypt in captivity. God had told Abraham before that, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. So here it is, 400 years of oppression. And these people are wondering, is God listening? Is God real? But here God finally comes and breaks through to Moses and said, I have heard the cry of my people. He says, the cry of the Israelites has now come to me. and I have chosen, and I have seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. I want you to think about all of these words that show that God is paying attention. God says, God has observed their misery. God has heard their cry. God says, I know they're suffering. And God says, the cry of the Israelites have come to me. God says, I've seen their oppression. God is paying attention. And sometimes when we think that God is tone deaf, let us remember that God is paying attention. But I also want to bring it to you, each of you, because we talk sometimes about the what we call the macro situations, the situations about in the entire society. But many of us are experiencing different things. You might be faced with a problem, a challenge, a situation that has been going on for a long time. I want to say to you, don't give up. Don't give up. Keep on crying to God. The God who observes, the God who hears, the Creator who knows, the Almighty who sees, the great I Am who listens, is still paying attention. But the God who pays attention is also what I consider to be the God of preparation. So, God is ready to bring about liberation. But there are some things that God does to prepare for that. In Exodus chapter 3, the story is often referred to as Moses and the burning bush. But I also want us to remind ourselves that another thing that we need to remind ourselves about is the call of Moses. Now, this day was many years in the making. I want you to notice how God had been preparing Israel for this day. So Moses had been born to a Hebrew family. And in the day that Moses was born, infanticide was the order of the day. The Israelites were being hunted down, and the Egyptians were told to cast their children in the river to kill the boys. And Moses, his mother, was determined that her son was not going to suffer the same fate of other Hebrew boys. He did not know then what God was planning. You know the story of how Moses was left at the Nile. And certainly God worked it so that Pharaoh's daughter came to the Nile. She came because that was their beach, the beach of their day. She came to go to the beach. And on the beach, she didn't know what was waiting for her, but she came upon this child, this kid who probably was crying. And as it worked out, the rest is history, because Moses' mother had worked it that his sister Miriam would be there and to offer her as a nanny to take care of this kid. So Moses grew up in the palace, but he was protected by his mother. So even as he was learning what it was like to be culturally an Egyptian, he was also learning what it was like to be spiritually and ethnically a Hebrew. His mother taught him all of the things that he needed to know. His mother taught him about his people. His mother taught him about his heritage. His mother taught him about his God. And so Moses was blessed by God throughout. God was preparing Moses all along for this journey. I remind you that Moses was about 80 years old when he took on the mantle of leading the children of Israel out of captivity in Egypt. So Moses' preparation took a while. Sometimes, God is preparing us for the task that God has. And sometimes that's probably why it takes so long. It's like building a house. And when a house is being built, it is amazing how much time is spent on the foundation. The foundation has to be laid well. Because if you don't have a firm foundation, you're not going to have a firm building. God is a God of preparation. God will sometimes use others to prepare us for the task that God has. And let us understand that in the midst of all of what is happening, God might have a job for us. And some of us say, why doesn't God do this? Or why doesn't God do that? But God might be calling us to be the instruments of God's peace and God's love. Moses' mother was, the one that Pharaoh's daughter had hired to take care of him. So Moses had love all around. Moses grew up in an environment, and so his natural mother loved him, and his adopted mother doted over him. Moses understood what it was like to navigate the corridors of power in Egypt. His grandfather, Pharaoh, was someone who loved him and cared for him. And he saw in Moses a future leader of Egypt. But God had other plans. And sometimes we just have to be faithful to God because God has plans for us. And when we talk about preparation, that is why I want us to focus constantly on preparing our kids and our young people. I want us to remember that the kids that run around the church today are our doctors and our teachers and our leaders of the future. They are our attorneys, and they are our Frederick Douglasses and Martin Luther Kings and our Moseses of the future. And so we need to spend time and energy in them, and we need to continue to commit to them and commit to others. And not just our children, but our young people. And we need always to make sure that we mentor those who come after us so that they can understand the challenges that they face. And some of us need to always remember that God is preparing us too. But God doesn't just prepare us. And so when I was in high school, there were times I was writing and preparing work, and I would spend so much time preparing. And then at the end, I wouldn't have enough time to do the writing. And one of the things that our teachers always reminded us when we did essays, yes, spend time getting our facts together. But unless you put your facts on the paper, I won't have anything to grade. So the God of attention and the God of preparation is what I want to say, a God of action. So at the right time, God was there to have some action. You see, God declares, I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land. And God brings it home to Moses, and God says, so come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. I want you to notice how the God of action works. So Moses is in this place, in the desert, because Moses had run away from Egypt. Moses had seen an Egyptian ill-treating an Israelite, and Moses had intervened. And when Moses intervened, in the middle of being so angry about the injustice that he saw, he killed the Egyptian. He committed murder. I don't think he had gone out of his way to kill this Egyptian. But in the middle of all of what was happening, he committed murder. And when he realized that it was known and that he probably would have been arrested and probably killed, that was when he ran away. Now, here is the thing. Moses was moved by the anger that he experienced and by the injustice that he witnessed. But he was taking things up on his own. You see, God all the while had been preparing Moses, but that was not yet the time for Moses to act. Sometimes we know that we have to do something, but sometimes we don't know what to do. I want us to understand how it is that God prepares us, but ultimately God calls us to act. And when God calls us to act, then is the time that we need to act. Sometimes in order to act, God uses us in various situations and circumstances. I believe that some of the situations that we get ourselves in or where we face are not just haphazard situations, but that God has prepared us and God has put us there. God has put us in some of the jobs that we have. God has put us in some of the offices where we are. God has put us in some of the neighborhoods where we are. God has put us in some of the families where we find ourselves. God has put us in some of the places where we are. And God has probably a task for us, even as God had a task for Moses. Now, sometimes we don't think we're up to the task. You see, Moses figured that he could act and get rid of this Egyptian that was harassing the Israelites. But when it came to leading the children of Israel, he did not think that he was up to the task. And so he started to say that he could not do this. He felt inadequate and reluctant. But the God of action said to Moses, I will be with you. I will be with you. You're not going to be alone. So, most of us are aware of how God then guided Moses through a 40-year trip through the wilderness to the promised land. A 40-year journey. It was long, but God gave him patience. It was hard, but God gave the children of Israel endurance. It was unpredictable, but God gave them hope. And sometimes your situation that you face might be long. Sometimes your situation that you face might be hard. And sometimes the situation that you face might be unpredictable. But the God of action is still with you. God didn't stop walking with God's people when Moses died. God didn't stop walking with God's people when Joshua died. God didn't stop walking with God's people when Isaiah died. And with all of these people, one thing that was constant was God says, I will be with you. God is still with us today. And we have to remember that. I don't know where you are in your spiritual journey, especially in a day when we have a pandemic on the one hand and a period of national reckoning on the other hand. In a day when we still don't know what will happen in terms of the economy. In a day when we still don't know how things will turn out, even as we seek to return to normal. In a day when some of us have had experiences at home, at work, at school, that we sometimes don't feel comfortable talking about. However, I want to remind you that no matter what your situation on this 5th of July, no matter what your situation in 2020, no matter what your situation 244 years after the Declaration of Independence, I want to remind you that the God of Moses is still your God. The God who was Lord of ancient Israel many centuries ago is still God in the United States in the 21st century. This is still a God who pays attention, who's focused on preparation, and who above all is engaged in action. To those who have asked, or maybe asking the question, I respond to you in this way. Yes, God is still listening. Amen.